Thank you for coming, and congratulations, Harold, on the publication of the collected poems of Marcel Proust. And I thought maybe the best way to start our conversation, which I hope we'll talk about Proust as a poet and as a novelist and Proust in general, would be to say, my first reaction when I heard about this book was I didn't know Proust was a poet. And you say in your introduction to the book that Proust wrote poetry comes as a surprise to even avid readers. So to get started, let me ask you, was Proust a poet? And if so, what kind?
Was Proust a poet? Yes, he was a poet. He wrote at least 104 poems. I guess that makes him a poet. He wasn't, I guess you wouldn't really say he was a professional poet, but then most poets don't make much money from their poetry anyway, right? You would know that?
I would know that for sure.
So what he did was he even when he was writing, thinking he was going to be a poet, he wrote for magazines, which you understand, right?
I think I do.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, he was a poet. I think one of the interesting things about his early life is that, like most young people who want to be writers, he wrote poetry. He wrote lyric poetry, the first attempt at In Search of Lost Time, which later became known as Jean Saintoy, was really about someone who wanted to be a poet. So I think that early on, as he was trying to decide which of the, what direction he was going to go in, was he going to be a poet, was he going to be a critic, was he going to be a novelist, and he wrote that poetry. I think the poetry he published really was in Pleasures and Days, and that he had written in 1893 and 1894. It was published in 1895. So was he a poet? Yes. Now I think that the underlying question that you may be asking is, was he a good poet? And I'll just have to sort of preface it with, I asked one very, very prominent poet if he would translate specifically some of the poems that I sent him. And he said, Proust, I'd love to translate Proust's poetry. And then he looked at the poems and he said, I don't think I want to translate Proust's poetry. So they're very uneven. I mean, some of them are really, really good and really interesting, and others are boring, dull. Which is understandable because, especially the early ones, he was trying for something. And especially the ones that appeared in Pleasures and Days, they were, as I read in the introduction, they were ekphrastic, and he was really trying to write about art, visual arts. He was trying to write about music, as didn't Woody Allen say, it's like dancing about architecture. And so I think that he sees himself in this vein and in a tradition of writing poetry, the way Baudelaire wrote ekphrastic poetry, and the way Nerval did. But as a good poet, I think he was interesting as a novelist.
Yeah. So I think one of the reasons people will read the book is to get insight into the novelist, into the writer who they know already. One thing that, as you were talking, reminded me that, of course, one of the themes of the novel In Search of Lost Time is the discovery of the artist's vocation by the narrator. But I don't think we ever see him writing verse, or do we? We see him writing prose. There's the passage where he sees the steeple and he is inspired to write prose, and it becomes sort of his first experience of what it might mean to be an artist, but then we see him repeatedly fail to follow up on that inspiration and sort of lose his way. Does he ever want to be a poet in the novel? Is that?
I don't think he does. There are probably better people than I am here. That Bill Carter's in the front row. Nobody would know better than him. But no, I don't think. I think that was left behind when he wrote the first sketch. And I think that in the early 1950s, when Jean Saintoy was published, it was a sketch, really, a very long sketch. And Contre Sainte-Beuve was published. There was this kind of understanding of which direction was he going to go in, and he ended up going and taking a third path. And so and with Jean Saintoy being about a person, a young man who wanted to be a poet, I think he sort of left that behind. And it was then about what kind of novelist, what kind of writer was he going to be.
Well, one thing that we'll discuss as we start looking at specific poems is that there are very different veins that he's writing in. There are sort of the more romantic, more serious poems, and then there's a lot of sociable verse to friends. But so we've discussed some of his other books, Pleasures and Days and Contre Sainte-Beuve, and his translations of Ruskin, all of which I think when we think about Proust, we think of them as preparatory to writing the novel. Are the poems preparatory to the novel in some way?
Well, I don't think so.
Mm.
I really, I think that Proust deals with similar themes, but I wouldn't exactly say that you get a lot of insight into the novel from the poems.
Mm.
I think you get more of an insight into the novel from the notebooks and the letters.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that he develops the themes to a certain extent in the notebooks and the letters more than he does in the poems. There are similar things that he does, especially in the prose poems, that you can see him, working on aspects of a similar style to what he is doing in the novel. But they're very undeveloped. They're very undeveloped. And then when he becomes a novelist, or when he starts to become a novelist, I think the verse really does move into a light vein, or using the structures of other verse, the structures of romantic poetry. One of the translators, Marcel Proust, actually, she was working with her father, and her father said he can see hints of medieval French poetry in some of the works. So I think it's all imbibed and then brought back out. But as for giving us a lot of insight into the novel, I wouldn't exactly say that. I think you get more insight into the person, who will then give you some insights into the novel.
Yeah.
I think one of the things I was reading this morning, and you see in the poems, you see a lot of immediacy, and there's some broad humor. And sometimes I think when reading the novel, you forget that there is sometimes very immediate and broad humor. So I was reading this morning about how about his describing Charlus's posterior. When he meets Morel on the train station, and it's absolutely hysterical, but it's very much more like the verse, because he actually just sort of goes, right for the juggler. That's not what a juggler is, right?
Right for something.
I don't know anatomy like that.
Well, let's talk a little bit. One reason why the notes are so important in this book and so extensive is that as you get into the later phases of the book, and a lot of the poems are addressed to Proust's friends, and they're full of in-jokes, and they're full of references to things that the friend would have known. What was it like editing this book? Can you talk a little bit about the publication history of these poems? They've been published in French and I think Italian, but never before in English.
Well, in 1982, two French scholars really published them in one of the Cahiers Marcel Proust. And I would assume, and there wasn't a lot of introduction, but I would assume that they spent several years combing through the archives that Proust's niece, Susie Proust, she had a lot of this stuff, and then they all went to the Bibliothèque Nationale. And they must have combed through these things for years, because these were things that were on envelopes, they were scrawled in letters, and published them in 1982 in this Cahiers, and there were 98 of them that they published. And then in 1991, Anne Burrell, who's this absolutely wonderful Proust scholar, and some other scholars in France, published a book called Écrits de Jeunesse, and did more extensive notes, much more extensive notes than were in the Cahiers. And she published 4 of them, including Pederasty, which is probably the most well-known one in English now, since it's been published in the New Yorker and in the Daily Beast. And so, that's the one, probably the Proust poem that's become the most well-known, the one that we really have. So went to that, but in 1989, Einodi published, an Italian publisher, published 97 of the 98 poems, but it was a kind of an odd, I can call it a translation, because he actually got rid of all the line endings, got rid of all the rhythm, and it almost didn't seem like poems anymore. I mean, Proust uses a lot of very traditional form. He does a lot of sonnets, a lot of Alexandrian lines, and so Einodi actually did it with none of this. It was a very odd translation. And I asked the people in France if they knew of any other translations, if Gallimard knew of any other translations, and they did. They had no, they didn't know that anybody else had done it. So I'm surprised that somebody asked me today, why haven't the French published it? Why didn't they publish it in book form? I think, and this is something that people have pointed out, in the introduction I say that it took the Germans and the Americans to make people read Proust. And because the French weren't as enamored of him in the 1920s and 1930s, accepting his set, as the Americans turned out to be, especially after Edmund Wilson wrote about him and other scholars were writing about him. So I think that now that it's been published in English by the Americans in a bilingual edition, I think the French are going to catch up. They're always behind anyway, but I think that they'll catch up. I think they will.
Yeah, I was surprised to read that in the introduction, and I never knew that. But I mean, I knew that he had won the Prix Goncourt, right, for the second volume.
Right.
And then was a sensation, and everyone was writing about him in England and in Germany. Walter Benjamin wrote about him.
Right.
Edmund Wilson wrote about him. But in France, they were not. He was not.
I don't think, you know, according to what I've read, he was not as embraced in France at that point.
Yeah.
Compared to the way he was embraced in the United States. I mean, if you look around, you can go into almost any secondhand bookstore in the United States and find that 2-volume Random House version that everyone has sort of given up after, when your grandmother dies and you get rid of all her books, there's always that 2-volume Random House that with, 600 words per page, and it's almost impossible to read, and certainly impossible to carry around. So thank heaven for Random House for bringing it out in separate volumes.
So we're actually ahead of the French in publishing the poems. You mentioned the poem Pederasty, and that's what I wanted to ask you about, and maybe we could talk about the circumstances in which it was written, because as you mentioned, the circumstances of a lot of these poems are a big part of their meaning and their appeal, and as you read the notes, you see poems that were written on the back of an envelope that his father sent him, or a poem that was written on the reverse side of the notes he was taking for a class, and so you really get a sense of Proust living his life and then writing verse in the midst of it. But would you read this first poem, Pederasty, which is subtitled To Daniel Halevi?
I'm going to read it in English, so bear with me. If I tried to read it in French, I would be stoned by any French speaker in the background. So, Pederasty, To Daniel Halevi. This is translated by Richard Howard. If I had money from a boundless mint and sinew enough in hands, lips, loins, I'd shun the vanity of politics and print and leave. Tomorrow? No, tonight, for lawns luminous with artificial green, without the rustic flaws of frost and vermin, where I'd forever be sleeping with one warm child or other. François, Fermin. For what is manly mockery to me? Let Sodom's apples burn acre by acre. I'd savor still the sweat of those sweet limbs. Beneath a solar gold, a lunar nacre, I'd languish, an ars moriendi of my own, deaf to the knell of dreary decency.
Well, there are a couple of things that occurred to me reading this. One of which is, as you mentioned, Richard Howard, that it's quite a free translation.
Oh, it's free is not the word.
Yeah. So if you, this is a dual language edition, so if you read the French, you'll see that certain things that he's put in, for instance, let Sodom's apples burn. There's no Sodom in the original. There's no ars moriendi.
Well, there's Sodom, but it's understood.
Understood.
It's implied.
Yes, right.
So, I mean, one of the things that Richard does is if something is implied, he decides if he wants to make it specific.
Yeah. And the book as a whole is by a number of different translators.
Yes.
You've got, in fact, it's a who's who, really, of French translators.
Right.
So we seldom, I mean, we think of Proust as a gay writer, but in the novel itself, the narrator, of course, is never said to be a gay character.
The narrator is one of the only non-gay characters in the book. I mean, everyone else, as time goes on, has discovered of having gay relationships, and the narrator is somebody who is never seemed to be gay.
So here we have Proust speaking in his own voice in defense of Pederasty. Is that what this poem is about?
In defense, I think it's more of a suggestion to a friend.
It's a seduction poem, right?
Yes.
And was the suggestion accepted or rejected?
No, it was rejected. I mean, I think that one of the things that you, in reading the letters, you see Proust implying that if they don't pluck this fruit, as he put it, when you're young, you are going to be in a position later on that you can't.
Right.
So let's do it now, because 10 years from now, you are going to be in other circumstances that you're not going to be able to pluck that forbidden fruit.
Do you think that maybe because this was a personal document, a private document, I mean, one thing that that struck me reading the novel last year again is that when I was teaching it, and that I ended up discussing a lot with students, is that, as you say, all the characters turn out to be either, it seemed to me, either gay or Jewish, right, or both. And Proust, who was gay and Jewish, takes those characteristics out of the narrator completely, and sort of displaces them. But reading the poems, we might see more of the biographical Proust, right,
Oh, sure.
as opposed to the narrative.
Yeah.
And he's willing to maybe write more openly about these things.
Well, I mean, I think you could say he's willing to write more openly because he didn't expect them to be published. I mean, there are several poems there that he actually says, burn this after you see it. I mean, usually that has more to do not with homosexuality, but with his making biting comments about someone whom they both know, or the writer and the recipient would know.
Right.
So like Lucien Laval, the soprano, who was once described by a critic as looking like a rock lobster when she's saying Wagner. So I think that those were the things he didn't want to, offend anybody, so he asked them to. But I think in the early poems and in a lot of the early letters, he didn't expect to be a famous man, so that he could be very open about those things. So he never expected to go any further. But at one point in his life, when he realized I think probably after around the time that he won the Prix Goncourt, that he was a public person and that his letters could be published. Because I think that was in response to Flaubert's letters being published. I'm not sure. That he realized that his letters could be published, so he wanted to see if he could block it. And as I say in the introduction, I don't think he ever expected that the poems would ever. I mean, he probably even forgot that some of them had been written. But he never expected that. I couldn't imagine that he would ever expect that the poems would be published. And this, Pederasty was actually not found in his archive. It was found in Daniel Levy's archive in Proust's hand. And that's why the scholars believe it's Proust's poem, especially since he was writing at that time to Jacques Bizet and Daniel Levy about homosexuality.
Another poem, and maybe one that's more of an artwork, or striving to be more of an artwork, is an untitled poem, which is number 7 in the book. And I thought maybe if you'd like to read that one, we can talk about that one also. It's one of the poems that seems to me to anticipate the artist, to anticipate the Proust that we know, in the sense of he's discovering an artistic vocation and claiming it.
It's interesting that you picked this poem to discuss, because I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what he was basing this on, what author he was basing this on, and couldn't quite figure it out because I couldn't figure out what author it sounded like. It sounded, in many ways, much older than the 19th century. But I still, maybe you would know better than I would, but I tried to figure it out and just went through, lots and lots of poetry, just trying to figure out what the tone was in the last stanza, and could not quite figure it out. It seemed like metaphysical poetry at one point, and but I just couldn't quite figure it out. So it's, did you want me to read it? Or?
Yeah, sure, if you would.
Okay. This was translated by Wayne Kessenbaum. In my head I housed a bird sickly and bizarre, who sang better than springs, than forests, whose solemn voices we nonetheless adore. Bird melancholy and sometimes smiling. To shield your frailty I shut myself tightly against the frost, the filthy air, and village rain. Flowering, my bird stayed near the fire that rustled when winter unrolled its desolate tableau. Alas, I opened too wide the window and door. I saw action, pleasure, obscure words. Someone entered deadly to the bird's pure gaze. Who barged in? My dear beast died. Who was this bird? What celestial flame extinguished itself, abandoned me for the sun? Sometimes, waking startled from the slumber that makes up our life, I tell myself, it was my soul. The sacred bird is our poet, our soul. Our soul is poetry. Alas, O bird self-slain, somnambulance plaintive, caressed or battered, toward what verse goal do we race, oblivious to our soul?
Well, one thing that is the poem, I think it's the Baudelaire poem, The Albatross, isn't that right?
Yes.
That made me, it made me think of that, in the sense that it's the poet's soul, the poet's self is sort of unable to live in the world. It's not exactly too good for the world, but too delicate for the world.
Yeah. I think the theme is very much Baudelaire, but the style seemed very different. And I looked at the albatross and I thought, because that was the first thing I thought with the bird.
Yeah.
And I looked at the albatross, but the tone of the poem was so different. And I said, where is this tone coming from? Yeah, the theme I can understand, but I couldn't figure out where the tone was coming from.
Well, one of the things that comes out very strongly in the novel is this, when I look at the stanza, it says, "Alas, I opened too wide the window and door, I sought action, pleasure, obscure words. Someone entered deadly to the bird's pure gaze, who barged in, my dear beast died." This sense that if you open up to the world comes rushing in, that the interiority, the self, sort of flees and is no longer there. And that seems something that the novel explores at great length. That, for instance, in all the discussions of his friendship with Robert de Saint-Loup, that who is such a good friend to him, to the narrator, and does things for him, takes care of him, is really an idealized kind of friend. And yet repeatedly Proust will write, any time spent in the company of a friend is wasted.
Well, that's one of the interesting things about the poetry, because the poetry actually lionizes friendship in many ways. I mean, I think that he is very impish, and there are barbs definitely against his friends, but the friendships are obviously very important to him. And then if you look at the novel, friendship doesn't always work. I mean, friendships are undermined, or the narrator undermines the friendships. But in Proust's life, and this is one of the questions about, how is the novel different from when he was writing the poetry? How is the vocation different from the avocation? And I think that he is much more willing to, it's not, this is a different type of art, and it's in service of a different thing.
Yeah.
And it's really about the connection that he's making with his friends and the people that he knows, compared to the distancing that he feels from his characters in order to create art.
Yeah. It was much commented on during his lifetime that Proust was thought of as a socialite, a social butterfly, a snob. People did not expect great things from him. And then, as he discusses at the very end of the novel, he sort of withdrew from the world and decided, this is the time, now or never, I'm going to make myself into an artist. And so the verse, a lot of the verse is from the phase when he's in the world. And in that way, it's more of the biographical Proust rather than the artist Proust. And of course, one of the things that he argues in the novel, or insists on in the novel, is that those two things are completely different. That you can never deduce the artist from the person you meet in society, or vice versa.
Well, in that way, it's interesting that in publishing any sort of biography, or as I call this, the grace notes on a biography, you can say that you're countermanding Proust's orders, in the sense of he may not have wanted this stuff out there because it can affect the way you read the novel. I mean, but it's inevitable. I mean, I think that he realized that himself, that there was an inevitability that people would look at his life, because people always do. It's very seductive. I mean, people really want to know about Proust's life, and I think that's one of the reasons that people will even read the poetry. They want to see that other side of Proust that they may not see through the novel, because the novel is very distant in many ways from Proust.
Yeah, and it creates this illusion more than any other book. It creates the illusion that you are getting to know the author. You're getting to know the mind of the author in such great depth and detail, and then at the same time, it constantly insists this is fiction. No one in this book, he says, no one in this book is real, except for a funny moment when he's talking about the First World War, and he says, no one in this book is real except for the relative of Francoise who did something self-sacrificing for someone who was affected by the war. And it sort of punches a hole in the fabric of the novel, because Francoise, of course, is fictional. So if Francoise is fictional, then how could her cousin be real? And it sort of becomes a Mobius strip of fiction and reality.
And he does tease you in the novel by actually saying, if the author of this book had the same name as the character, the character has the same name as the author, and then calls him Marcel. And so there is that tease about autobiography, and there is a whole series of writings about when Proust pops his head through the novel and actually is writing as Proust, but I don't know if you can ever figure that out.
Yeah. Let's talk about, we talked about Baudelaire a little bit. Are there other influences on the poetry that you see, or people who would have been important to him growing up?
Well, I think that there are a couple of influences. It's not only the literature that he read, even though he was like one of the world's great readers of all time. And he sort of took all this stuff in, and then when he was writing, he wrote it all back out. And as I say in the introduction, I'm not even sure if he knew where those influences ended and his own work began. But it's also about the other arts that he brings into it. And I think you do see that here, because he does bring in music and painting into that. And it's, of course, shot through in the entire novel.
Yeah.
Now, I think that when he was reading in those days, the poets that he was reading, he loved Nerval, he loved Baudelaire, he loved Nerval. So those were people who were important to him. What's interesting in the novel, too, I think, is that you don't really get a lot of contemporary stuff. I mean, his railing against Mallarmé and against what were called the symbolists at the time against obscurity. And he also wrote again about Jean Moréal, who was a Greek who changed his name to Jean Moréal, I can't remember his Greek name, but as a sort of leader of the younger school, not even among the symbolists, but were these fawning poets of the time. So he was railing against that. So I think it was the past, I guess in Proust, this is sort of a strange thing to say, but the past was the most influential part of what he took in and what he brought back out, in addition to his exploring the idea of the past.
Yeah, and when you think of verse in the novel, you think maybe of Racine. He quotes a great deal, often in suggestive or humorous or ironic contexts.
And especially Racine's very interesting, because Racine was also dealing with the past. So it's not only is he writing about Racine, but he's writing about Racine writing about the past.
Right.
So he's writing about the Racine's period, looking back, with Racine looking back 2,000 years. Right. So it actually telescopes, and there's some very interesting scenes about the discussion of Racine, but especially when I think he's watching Phèdre, and he's sitting in the audience, and he's looking at the contemporary society, and then he goes back to the stage, and looks back and looks back like that. So he's sort of in the middle, trying to figure out, is he going to do the same thing with them, and the sensibility-wise, that Racine did with the past himself.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the sort of mixture of genres. Some of the poems, or in fact some of the only poems that were actually published in his lifetime, I think, were the ones that were in Pleasures and Days, which was his sort of work of juvenilia, published when he was in his early 20s. And many of them are either addresses to poets, to painters, not poets, painters or composers. Were these painters and composers people who were especially important to him? Oh yeah, I mean, I think one of the things about it is that you do find when you do the research that, especially when you get people like, Watteau was very important to him, but in particular, Cuyp, for example, he later travels to Dordrecht in, I think it's 1902, and so it's several years later, but there were a lot of Dutch and Flemish painting reproductions on the walls of the house where he grew up. So they were, he started out where that was a big part of it. So. Yeah, and there's this, you can almost sense this attempt to write himself into art in a certain way, that through his poetry he's going to claim some sort of kinship with Watteau, for example, which I think might be my favorite one of these poems. So I think he does that, again, he does that in the novel as well, where he realizes that the artist is going to take these real people and write them into art. And I think, to me, one of the great scenes it takes place in Venice, where he imagines his mother in a frieze on the ceiling in one of the churches in Venice. And he actually has taken her up, literally moved her up with his eyes into this work of art. And of course, that's what he's going to do with his novel. I mean, very soon thereafter, the narrative ends, and he has taken his mother and put her into this frieze. Yeah. Would you like to read Watteau? Sure. This is number 20 in the book. And this was also translated by Richard Howard. Antoine Watteau. Twilight staining faces under the trees with its blue cape, its dubious mask. The dust of kisses round exhausted mouths. What's vague is tender now. What's near, remote. The masquerade, another sad escape, misquotes love's gestures. Winsome, woebegone. A poet's whim, a gallant's vigilance. Love requires a careful staging here. Here boats and picnics, music,
silences.
I feel like that captures the Watteau mood, the world of it very well, and shows that he's sort of trying to find the formula almost for visual art in words, which of course he does in the novel with visual art and with music, with those great descriptions of landscapes and paintings, of invented violin sonatas. There's a sort of synesthesia going on.
Yes. You know, one of the things about the 18th century in particular, and the Fête Gallant paintings, is that, remember that the Goncourt brothers were very interested in that period as well, and that supposedly had a great deal of influence on Art Nouveau. And I actually went to a lecture back in 2000 at the University of Illinois, in which the scholar, whose name I can't remember, was trying to convince everybody there that Proust was an Art Nouveau writer. And you know, I think that you can probably do that if you look hard enough. I'm not sure about the style, but I think that there was an interest there because it was all around. I mean, the Goncourt brothers in particular brought back the 18th century and sort of recreated that as part of the Art Nouveau. And those flourishes and those movements of the visuals of the 18th century really are reproduced in many ways in the flowing curlicues, whatever you call them, of that period.
And there's some Art Nouveau influence on the design of the book, too.
Yes, but that was my fault.